Space shop. Parasites. Horrible creatures. No matter how horrible or repulsive, one can't help but feel the scratching feeling of intrigue. Intrigue, however, is dangerous. Intrigue leads to obsession, which leads to delusion. Delusion is a wonderful thing in itself. Without delusion, the more wriggly aspects of life would remain shrouded in confusion and misunderstanding. Henry and Gwen are delusional. Their delusion is not the affliction of a parasite, but of an illness. Love. Love is a wonderful thing that leads to its own delusion. These delusions weaken our awareness of dangers. Normal people care not for these delusions. Henry and Gwen are normal people. They care not for delusions, but they unknowingly have many. The two lovers walked down the road, past many buildings they had become painfully aware of. Gwen leaned tenderly against her lover, who swept back his crew cut for which he had forgotten the style that morning. He stops Gwen suddenly and directs her attention towards a queer shop that neither of the delusional devotees could recognize. Standing before them was a poorly kept building that stood horribly astray from the modern architecture. The building was clearly a pub that had since been repurposed. Musky green paint cracked and peeled, revealing small holes. Henry could have sworn he saw small white bugs wriggling within the holes. Shrugging away his feeling of discomfort, he spoke. "Babe, it's a makeup shop." Henry chirped as he pointed towards the sign above the door, written in cracked black wooden letters nailed onto a rotting yellow background with a warped green boundary. "Compounds and creams. Face shop." The couple stepped up old steps that moan and through a door that screamed as if to warn those who enter. They stepped into a room with 3 large aisles of makeups and cosmetics galore. Beyond the shelves lay a long counter. Large, pale circle where stools used to stand stood from the dark brown floor. An elderly man dressed straight from the 1930s stood behind the counter. "Feel free to look for whatever you need," the man's voice crackled, seemingly electronically. His voice, a painfully obnoxious New Orleans accent, seemed to come from every direction instead of from him. One thing about the man never changed the whole time they were in the store. The man smiled like a child trying his best to lie about breaking mother's favorite vase. As Gwen perused the aisles, Henry walked towards the salesman. Every aspect of the man's age seemed to rewind as Henry walked closer to the counter. Now a young man in his late 20s smiled through Henry. Taking a second look behind him, Henry realized that the store too looked as young as the man, still smiling behind the counter. Behind the man were racks of fine jewelry and accessories, mainly for men. "Hello, good sir," spoke the man, who sounded as if his voice was played on a radio, as vintage as his attire. As he spoke, the man reached across the counter to shake Henry's hand. Henry grabbed the man's hand, expecting the man to shake. The man held his arm perfectly still. "Well?" The man's voice flared, unaccompanied by his lips. "You do know how to shake, don't you? Show me you have some proper class and style." Henry softly shook his hand. "Ha!" the man laughed without moving his teeth. "You gesticulate like a bat." Henry retrieved his hand from the man's white-gloved hands. "Bat?" asked Henry. "What does that mean?" The man replied without a slight hesitation. "Prostitute. It's a slang term we used in the 1930s. The man smiled wider than ever, seemingly mocking Henry. Henry grabbed the man's hand, expecting the man to shake. The man held his arm perfectly still. "Well?" The man's voice flared, unaccompanied by his lips. "You do know how to shake, don't you? Show me you have some proper class and style." Henry softly shook his hand. "Ha!" the man laughed without moving his teeth. "You gesticulate like a bat." Henry retrieved his hand from the man's white-gloved hands. "Bat?" asked Henry. "What does that mean?" The man replied without a slight hesitation. "Prostitute. It's a slang term we used in the 1930s. The man smiled wider than ever, seemingly mocking Henry. "Fuck off, prick. Why even bother to use that slang in 2019? Nobody will understand you," Henry interrogated, flustered. The man's radio voice crackled to life from behind his teeth again. "Oh my, we've a feisty one here, Charlie." The man's mouth slammed open after saying this, introducing a new voice of a New York accent. "I heard him loud and clear. echoed the voice from within the man's mouth. Man, I haven't been this entertained since the stock market crash of 1929. The man continued as Henry gawked. The man confused. Oh, so many orphans. The man's voice trailed off into what sounded like faint static as he sighed fondly. Henry, trying to change the subject, asked, So how old is this place? The man promptly twisted back upright and politely answered, It was a brothel back in the 1930s, and before that, it was a pub, the man said matter-of-factly. How do you know all of this? Is this place like a family heirloom? Asked Henry, discomforted by the man's undying smile. I know a lot of things. The man's voice seemed to echo in Henry's mind now. Lots of things. The man's voice echoed, slowly this time. The man's eyes seemed to flash a quick slideshow of Henry's life from birth to then. Henry's ears rang as the man's smiling face seemed to grow ever larger. Ringing turned to the screams of men, children, and women. The screams ended abruptly as Gwen walked up to stand next to Henry and placed her items on the counter. The man turned attention to the items immediately and stared for several seconds before putting them in a bag. 1765. The man's voice. Yeah, damn. The man turned attention to the items immediately and stared for several seconds before putting them in a bag. 1765. The man's voice slid from between his teeth. Since you are my first couple since this place has been open, I'll give you some free moisturization cream. He turned to grab the glass container filled with the pale gray cream inside. Henry stared past the man, seeing that the racks were replaced with shelves full of the cream. He placed the items in a bag that he didn't pull from any drawer and handed it to Gwen and took the money from her. She scooped a small glob onto her index and middle finger. As she applied, she heard a faint static, as if a vintage radio was being tuned between channels. Through the corner of her eye, she thought she caught a glimpse of a man with a black fedora hat behind her shower curtain. She swept away the feeling with logic and kept applying. The static sound only grew louder, and she felt wriggling on her face, as if the cream was trying to kiss her. She sort of told herself that's what it was supposed to feel like. After she finished, she went to bed. She woke up the next morning and did her normal routine. She felt more hungry than usual, but strangely disgusted by the thought of eating. She choked down her toast and went to school. Aside from a strange morning, both Gwen's and Henry's day were relatively normal until every class was called to a pep rally where they would announce a prom king and queen of that year. Teenagers shuffled to their seats in the gym, and despite the event taking place in a high school, every student stayed silent and stared towards the basketball court, awaiting the announcement. Instead of the principal, a small nervous man, the salesman stood in the middle of the court with his piercing smile, shaving hairs off of people's faces. He spoke with his voice emanating from all around the room. This year's prom queen is, he paused, not for breath, Gwen Charleston. Gwen made her way down to the court, not recognizing the shopkeeper. Henry stared with guttural horror at the prim and proper man standing next to Gwen. Prom king is, of course, Henry Atrix. People clapped. Few whistled as Henry took his place on the court. Excuse me, my dear, you have something on your face, the salesman remarked, pointing towards Gwen's face. Gwen wiped her cheek and felt a warm sensation wriggle across the entire right side of her cheek. The squeal of a microphone rang throughout the gym. After everyone opened their eyes and brought their heads back up, the principal stood where the man had stood moments before. Nobody noticed as Gwen fell to the floor, bleeding profusely from the face. Paramedics were called, but at that point the bleeding stopped and she regained consciousness. No wounds or punctures were found on her face where she had been bleeding, and she was sent home early. Over the days, Gwen became skinny to a horrid degree. She still refused to eat, and she spoke of a man ripped from the 1930s who stared at her every night smiling. After 2 weeks of thinning at home, her skin tightened and began splitting against her bones. She began tearing at her eyes. Her parents rushed to her aid when they heard her screams. They crashed into her room to find Gwen foaming and spitting a pale gray cream-like substance. Worms wriggle from within the fluids, cracking from underneath her fingernails and scraping from behind her eyes, chipping teeth and eating her tongue. Before she could be helped, all that remained was a puddle of worms, crying and screaming in the cream. Sometimes when Henry sleeps at night, he asks the man why he did that to Gwen. Sometimes his answer was static that mocks him and laughs.